Okay. I know, I keep starting my videos with okay. But I kind of like that word. And if I'm pausing a lot, it's because I'm kind of like in this moment where I'm trying to figure out what I want this video to be because I have a lot of ideas stirring in my head, and a lot of it has to do with the multitude of stories and series that have been boiling in my head, and I keep thinking I need like just like a wall or something that I could just, sort of like map out all the stories and the universes and things that have been, brewing in my head just so I can get it out and look at it. But I don't have that kind of wall. Unfortunately, all I have are these videos, and these videos are not nearly as helpful when it comes to that. But talking about certain elements certainly is helpful, and I hope they are helpful for you. So I was thinking, do I want to tackle character development, or do I want to tackle rule making as part of world building? And the answer kind of is I kind of want to talk about both. Certainly, I know I want to talk about both eventually, but I'm kind of contemplating, do I want to talk about it together right now and do sort of an overview, and then later on do sort of a more expanded thing, or do I want to talk about one now and then the other later? And I just don't know what I want to do. And like, you guys will not see this, but I have probably started and stopped like 10 times now because I'm just, I'm just like, I want to do this video. I need to do this video. I have so many ideas for the video, but it's sort of like, I want to focus in on one thing. I don't want to get carried away and talk about a million and one things. So I'm thinking, maybe I should just let this be a little bit of an overview, because it all boils down to the concept of ideas. I had an uncle who asked me a question about how do I get my ideas. And I remember telling him I get them in different ways. I remember when I started book 3 of the original trilogy, I didn't actually have a story beginning. I actually had the end of the thing. And I had to kind of work my way from the end to the beginning. And sometimes that's actually a great way of doing it, because when you have a clear end point, and certainly, for me, I would say it's great because sometimes I have a problem with ending things, and it's probably because I think so much long term. That's why every idea I have inevitably can be turned into a series, because there's just so much world building and creativity that goes into it that I have to learn how to sort of like pull it back a bit. But for the idea of the end, when I had the end, I kept having to ask myself the question, what led to this end happening? And that allowed me to, in book 3, begin to, pull it forward until I was able to get, to the beginning of the story. Now, it was part of a trilogy, and you might be asking, well, but didn't you know the whole story from the beginning? And the answer is Not necessarily. And that probably is a bit of a problem. And that's probably why here I am now completely rewriting the whole trilogy, even though the story as a whole hasn't changed. And a lot of the major, I think, character beats have not necessarily changed, but the way that it looks, the landscape of it has gone through a complete and total transformation. If there's really anything that I want to drive home when it comes to ideas, it is, I want to drive home the necessity to not only be open to the ideas, but to be willing to take the time necessary to develop those ideas. And a good book that I won't say a good book that I found because I haven't read the whole book, but at the time it had a good part about idea creation and world building. But this is the book in front of you, Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction. Now, I say I didn't necessarily find it, and I haven't read it because I don't necessarily need that kind of help. I'm sort of at the point where I'm more concentrated on the problem solving aspect of it. But I bring up the idea creation because one of the things that is talked about when it comes to ideas is understanding that it may take years for not only your ideas to form, but for it to mature. And so I'm finding myself in that place. And I can certainly say and vouch for the validity of it because I have different series at different points of development. But I want to talk about that, about taking years to work through this. And that really kind of was what sparked this sort of like conflict within me about what to talk about, whether it be character or, rule creating or whatnot. And to a degree, they both kind of go hand in hand because the rules that you create in your world, whether it is, a regular fiction, as in it's in this established world that we live in, or whether it is a fantasy or sci-fi alien world, the rules that are created are rules that will have to be abided by. And it becomes important because this is also the world that your characters are going to be interacting in. And I find this incredibly important, probably because over the past few days, I've found myself watching videos about people's complaints on the show, The Legend of Korra. Now, I didn't watch it, and I did watch The Avatar. I kind of bowed out in season 3, so I won't say that I'm like a super fan like many of these others who loved that show. I was older. I was older at the time, not quite aged out of it, but I was kind of in a place of transitioning. And I say not aged out because I have a cousin who's older than me, and he loved the series all the way through. But the complaints that they were having on Korra had to do with the sort of character that Korra was and how the rules in the world no longer made sense. And that really got me to thinking, because it is kind of a pet peeve of mine when people don't pay attention to that kind of thing. Because, and this is where, when we get back to where, as I said, good ideas take time to grow. Great ideas actually take time to grow, because you need to have a level of believability. A lot of the problems, and I kind of go back to SJW comics, just because in the recent years I've read more comics than I've read, fantasy, but I know it's a huge problem even still, and I don't necessarily watch television anymore, so I can't necessarily talk about that aspect of it. But, I could talk about comics, and I can also talk about the Star Wars series and my problems with The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, because the two of those, the SJW comics and at this point SJW Star Wars, they really kind of go hand in hand, because you have in both cases platforms and materials that have established rules. And these established rules had been followed for decades. And people coming in, could get a quick sense of the rules of the world and the fact that the characters never deviated from that. And then you have these new iterations where the characters that you know and love are either replaced, or they become and they behave in ways that are abnormal to who they are and to who the world, had established that they were. In the case of Luke Skywalker, where he went from being the most optimistic character in the original trilogy, and I refuse to talk about the prequels. I am one of those. I was bored with the prequels, and the only thing that exists to me is the original trilogy. I'm probably not even going to see episode 9, because I just so angry with The Last Jedi. But he was hopeful, he was optimistic. He believed that Darth Vader could be redeemed. And then in this new trilogy, he went from hopeful to being this bitter man. And there's never any real rationality for why that became the case. And then you had Rey, who, and I remember even thinking during The Force Awakens, I'm watching everything that she was doing. And I remember in my mind thinking, gee, it's just amazing how she can do everything perfectly. And I didn't find that attractive. I didn't find that empowering. I found that upsetting, because an important part of building characters is giving your characters a fatal flaw. And there was never a fatal flaw in Rey. There's never a fatal flaw in SJW characters. Now, we as readers, we look at that and say, well, they're just an awful person. And I'm sure I've said before, you read a lot of SJW characters and they read more as villains than they read as heroes, because you find them despicable people to hang around. And that was a criticism of Korra, in that she was just an extremely unlikable character who never actually grew. I know I talked about it because I talked about writers needing to know their characters. So even as I talk about this, it's and talking about the criticisms and even looking at the fact of there needing to be a need for a fatal flaw, it should hopefully drive in the importance on that aspect. But I want to take it to that level deeper because I want to talk about the idea of the rule establishment in the world building. If you're doing a natural story set in the natural world, and this wouldn't necessarily, skip that. If you're doing rule establishment in the natural world, and your characters suddenly break that rule establishment in the regular world, it looks a bit odd. Think about it in terms of when you watch movies and the characters that you're watching somehow defy the rules of physics. The scene I'm thinking of is in Lord of the Rings, where they're falling down that mountain and you're sitting there and you're looking, and it's like these people would all be dead because of the laws of physics, and yet, in the movie, they pretty much come out unscathed. You can't necessarily always get away with that. If you have a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, and they could break the rules at any time, there's never any reason for your audience or your readers or your customers, there's never any reason for them to be invested. And that becomes wasted money. Because if you can't have people invested in your character, if there are never any stakes, if there's never a time where their fatal flaw is going to get in the way of them completing their task, then you're just going to have a one-dimensional character in a position where complexity is needed. I kind of found this to be true in my own work when it came to my villain, where I was kind of getting into this place where the villain was getting to be a little bit too much of the mustache twirling villain, where she just was so evil. She just did things for the sake of evil. And the only thing you could say about her character is evil, 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 evil. And there was never any complexity to her. Now, at the time, I hadn't really written too much about her because I focused solely on the heroes for the most part. But if, going back to the lesson of writers needed to know their characters, but if I didn't know who the villain was, if I couldn't even talk about her motivations, if I couldn't even explain that, then I didn't know her as well as I should have. And hopefully you see how it's all kind of coming together and coming to see how complex storytelling can really be, and that these are things that if you're trying to tell a good story, that you really have to think about it, because if we don't begin thinking and if we don't begin maturing ideas and we don't begin to let things grow and we don't allow our characters to grow because we're so frightened of what it would mean to have the characters, step outside of our comfort zone as creators, then we're doing damage to the art of storytelling. And And you can see it because a lot of these markets are shrinking because people are getting tired of the lack of good storytelling. They're tired of the lack of good character development. They're tired of established rules being broken for the sake of, liking this character that is an unlikable person. And if you're having trouble figuring out what a good definition of like a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu is, I know a lot of people have sort of defined it as a kind of like self-insert character. And I get that and I understand that, because they're saying it because it literally is the idea of a one-dimensional blank slate character. It is, and that's why I'm not necessarily into the whole self-insert definition. It's, even if I can see it, but if I would define it, I would say it's a one-dimensional character. Now, most of them, and the reason I say it's not self-insert is because they're so blank slated that they tend to be unlikable. They tend to be unrelatable because inevitably they're just there. If you look at Ray being an example, she's just there. I know a classic, I didn't see Twilight, so I can't even talk about it, but I know classically people have talked about like the Bella, but Bella would be Bella or Anastasia Steele from the Shades of Grey series. Those I would say would be like pure self-insert characters where they're even worse than Mary Sue's. They are just completely blank slates. A Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, they are a blank slate, but they're like a perfect blank slate. They're always liked. Everybody likes them. They're the characters that they never do anything wrong, even though they might destroy everything. That is the concept of, because now I'm thinking Man of Steel, because that is what Zack Snyder tried to do to Superman. They've always tried to turn Superman into a Gary Stu, but if you read the comics and you look at the movies and things like that, Superman isn't really, because even he would admit the fatal flaw that he has is the tornness he has of not being able to be everywhere at once. So, and he has a clear set of moralities and a clear set of reasoning as to why he is a hero. A Mary Sue or a Gary Stu doesn't have clear motivations of why they are doing what they do. They just sort of do it. And then because they're one-dimensional and they have no characterization, it's sort of like they just want to do what's right. And that's a terrible, it's terrible in the way that it becomes lazy. And I kind of feel like I'm going on too long because I'm digging myself deeper. I feel like I'm digging myself deeper and deeper and deeper into this topic. And I want to talk about characterization later because I want to sit down and actually, sort of write out concepts of characterization and why it's important and whatnot. But as this is an overview, it's important to note that a lot of work goes into building. And the reason I have my notebooks here is because a lot of this is just a portion of a lot of the work I go through in developing characters, developing stories, developing worlds. And if you're the kind that you don't want to take that kind of time to really develop things and really work through things and really begin to establish, then be prepared to take heavy criticism. And be prepared not to succeed. Because you can't create great things without a lot of hard work. And I know that that's kind of like a hard thing, especially for, this high-tech generation to understand. But take it from someone who comes from that sort of borderline generation. Hard work goes into doing great things. And when it comes to storytelling, when it comes to world building, you have to go through the hard work or it's going to fail. And that's where I'm going to leave it. If you like these kind of videos, hit the like button, subscribe. Please subscribe. Share it, whatever. I'm hoping to be able to continue to build these sort of things. And I'm going to say it up front, although, of course, when I finish my trilogy and I finish all my stories and stuff, of course, I would love for them to sell. I more want people to understand what it means to engage in true storytelling, because I want to see more stories out there. I want to feel like I can come back to reading and reading long books. And, certainly if you're someone who is interested in fantasy, I would love to read genuinely great, more apolitical fantasy stories, that leaves behind, people's personal politics. I know there's a lot of people that would, because it is incredibly important. So if you're like me and that's the kind of thing that you would like to build, then join the community and let's work toward making things like that happen. See you in the next video.